I'm Elvia Wilk, and I'm coming to you from inside my apartment in Brooklyn, New York. I'm really happy to be invited by the Bergen Kunsthal to do a reading virtually on the occasion of Adelita Husni Bey's exhibition Machtspiel. I'm a writer. I mainly write about art and politics, criticism and essays, but I also published a novel last year called Oval, which I'm going to read from in a little bit. The book is set in an alternate reality version of the city of Berlin, and it deals with issues like real estate speculation, environmental collapse, and love and friendship in an increasingly corporatized art world. Adelita's work has always been exciting to me because of the way she deals with the implicit separation between art world and real world, which of course we know is a cultural fiction that benefits only a few. There is no art without politics, and the reverse is true as well. The title of the central work in her exhibition, a film called Agency, documents a role play done by Italian high school students in 2015. The students improvised roles of democratic citizens in a nation state in order to explore and maybe find ways to mutate the power roles endemic to national structures. I also have an interest in role play as an artistic and political tool. Taking on assumed identities, purposefully appropriating social performance, and mutually creating fictions can be a type of embodied learning when it comes to grasping points of agency and testing models of acting differently in a very stale-seeming world. Role play takes place within a consent-based alternate reality, but the play doesn't begin or end when the game stops or starts. Players bring themselves into their assumed roles and then import what they've learned back into their real lives. Roleplay has been effective in various political situations and educational ones as a way of mediating interpersonal and geopolitical conflict as if they are existing within the same realm, which of course they are. In many ways, roleplay is the foundation of pedagogy and self-learning. Every time you do something new, it's a roleplay. But it's also an under-recognized method for reshaping society and our relationships. A few years ago, I ran a live-action role play of my own novel, which is pretty unusual. Fictional worlds from novels or movies are often the foundation of fantasy role plays, but taking your own novel and making a role play or a LARP out of it is not super common. The book was finished at the point that I did the role play, and I was working on editing the final draft, so the plot was pretty much in place. But allowing the participants in the game to assume the roles of the characters that I had made up and occupy the setting of the book gave me entirely new insights into the possibilities and limits of my designed world and the power dynamics within it. In short, during the roleplay, I was the game master, but I was also a half character, which is a somewhat common thing to do, to be a non-player character, basically. So I acted as a representative of a nefarious corporation in the book called Finster, which you will hear about, which dominates the urban space of Berlin in the book. It buys real estate, employs artists as corporate consultants, and it brands everything. Over the course of the 4-hour role play, the characters I had written basically found a way to revolt against me and the rule of the game. To explain, a central plot element in the book is the invention of the titular drug Oval, which is a made-up substance that induces financial generosity in the user. In the roleplay, the players found a way to give me, the game master and the representative of the corporation, the drug, after which I could not reasonably be in charge of the game anymore. So it was an incredible metaphorical representation of what it means to give a fictional world to a group of participants who take the reins and write it themselves. I think this book in particular lends itself to roleplay because so much of what it deals with on a plot level is social performativity. One of the scenes I'll read from takes place at an art opening, where the main character, a scientist, can't help but analyze the behavior and movements of the various attendees as an elaborate ritual resembling cellular division, a pre-programmed behavior. Another of the characters is obsessed with reality TV dating shows because she believes that even the creative culture class is beholden to relationship patterns we've inherited from mainstream society, that any amount of subversion or subversive pantomime doesn't actually work to disrupt. So at the core of the story is a love relationship between a man and a woman who can't get the balance of power between them right because they have no model for themselves for how to distribute emotional labor. By giving my invented characters autonomy and agency in the form of a role play, similar to the way Adelita sometimes does, I was able to start to imagine ways that they and we could all act differently in the stories that we tell ourselves about the way the world works. I wrote the book as a response to my own experiences and my own relationships inscribed within the geopolitical landscape, in which I felt like I often have no choice but to play a role. The main way of finding agency I've discovered is in creatively inventing relationships that don't accord with the laws of power as I've inherited them. Life is a series of fictions within fictions, and to treat the laws of our economic and political system as mutual fictions that are mutable can be a revolutionary act. In real life, you don't get to consent to the role you're assigned, but in a role play, everyone has to agree on the rules and limitations before you start. This is a practice in consensus building that we don't get in a lot of situations. It can be a testing ground for social practice and self-organization that I think most crucially is based on consent. This is not some kind of democratic civility exercise, but about creating safe grounds to test potentially dangerous ideas. You can act out anything in a role play if you've nailed down rules for safety and consent in advance. In her work, I think Adelita is similarly exploring the complex connections between interpersonal relationships, both in-game and out-of-game, and large systems of power that we rarely have access to on individual levels. This is a resonance between our practices that I hope emerges through my reading of some short sections of the book. So I'll start with an introductory bit to set the scene and then skip forward. And in the meantime, I'll show some images. This is the book. Once at a dinner party, Lewis had retold a story he'd read in the New Yorker. The article was an expose on Russian prisons in what was known as the Black Zone, a lawless section of the penitentiary where there was little supervision from above and the prisoners were basically left to govern themselves. In the Black Zone, rigid customs had developed that newcomers had to learn if they didn't want to get knifed. Most of the customs had originally been created for practical reasons, but by now they'd become arbitrary rules, whose only function was to enforce a sense of social cohesion. For example, there was one major taboo against throwing away crusts of moldy bread. Back in the early years of the Black Zone, when food had been scarce, it was necessary to conserve every morsel. Today, a healthy black market supplied champagne and caviar to the inmates, and yet the taboo against wasting bread remained. Throwing away rotten food marked the newcomer as an outsider, someone who didn't understand the history of want and deprivation from which the rules had evolved. With regards to bread, explained Lewis, the culture of the Black Zone was a culture of inclusion via conservation. This was more or less the situation in Lewis and Anya's 6-household eco-settlement, or eco-colony, or colonoscopy as the joke went, an assortment of experimental architecture clustered 1,000 meters up the side of the burg. The no-waste principle, according to which all inhabitants were responsible for monitoring the internal ecosystems and microclimates of their homes, was enforced by an internalized pressure based on imaginary rules, rather than any actual supervision from Finster Corporation above. The tiny red lights of the cameras blinking in every room were a sort of mental reminder of Finster's presence, of the abstract idea of monitoring. But Anya was sure nobody was actually watching. The contract was clear. The only spying being done was by a machine vision algorithm, whose job was to spot anomalies and flag worst-case scenarios: tornadoes, fire. This lack of explicit instruction had led to some conundrums. When they had first moved in, Anya would hike up the mountain each evening with a backpack full of biodegradables and other trash she had accrued throughout the day in order to dump them down the disposal and enter her total net waste into the recycling system. It was her waste wherever she produced it, and she was going to be honest about it. But the surplus of wrappers and crusts and tissues had started to clog the drain unit and overflow the toilet. Anya was wasting way more matter than the house could make go away. "Couldn't you throw this stuff away somewhere else?" Lewis asked her, scooping chunks of foul-smelling paper pulp from the kitchen drain. He pulled out a long, thick strip of blue and brown paper. "What is this, a shopping bag from the mall?" "I just used it to carry all my other trash in. Jesus, it's not like I was shopping at the mall." He stared at her, dangling the wet strip. "You brought home a random bag from a fast fashion store, which you only use to carry your other trash in, and you put it down our drain." "Yes, that's what I did. I used the bag. Ergo, it's part of my waste output." Lewis frowned. "I think the waste thing only applies when you're at home on the mountain." "No, I don't think it's spatial. It's about what you waste in your whole life as a human consumer. The whole point is to cancel us out completely." Anya realized she was clasping her hands earnestly. Without meaning to, she glanced up toward where she knew the camera was, nestled above the cabinets. "Right, that's what it says on the website, Anya, but everyone knows we're just supposed to be making it seem like the house works. We're trying to prove that it's possible to live sustainably and not be such a freak about it, which means not carrying your trash around everywhere." Anya unclasped and reclasped her hands. "But throwing waste away in other places is cheating. If the house can't handle all my waste, then the designers didn't do a good job and they should fix it." "They obviously did not do a good job, Anya. Nothing in this fucking house works. I'm not going to drag all my trash home every day. It's just not realistic. You want me to save the packaging from my lunch? Where does it stop? Am I supposed to wait to shit until I get home?" "Wait, why are you eating lunch with disposable packaging? I bought you a lunchbox." Eventually, Lewis's practicality had won out as it tended to. He was right. Anya couldn't wait to shit until she got home, and she couldn't keep track of everything she used. Trying to do so had led to an ontological breakdown on the micro level of her daily life. Were eyelashes and skin cells on par with hair ties and coffee cups? Were paper coffee cups on par with a mug that had to be rewashed using gray water from the house, which cost energy to pump? She couldn't bring herself to ask the neighbors how they were handling things, convinced that everyone else automatically understood the rules. To reveal her confusion would be to reveal all, including her doubts. That had been only a few months ago. But lately, as more elements of the system were getting clogged or bogged down, the two of them had started to perform exactly the opposite of what Anya had originally done. They carried their trash down the mountain and disposed of it clandestinely in orange trash canisters on the street. At first, Anya felt ashamed marching down the slope with a backpack loaded with a bundle of trash flattened against her laptop. But Lewis assured her they were just doing what was expected of them, putting a good, clean base on sustainability. Eventually, bringing trash off the mountain seemed just as responsible as bringing trash onto it once had. Chapter 2. Anya skidded down the slope, which is becoming muddy from overuse by feet. It still hadn't been paved or even scattered with gravel, since Finster didn't want to admit that the state of the pathway could no longer reasonably be called temporary. Rather than upgrade the provisional solution to make it slightly more functional in the interminable interim, it was ignored as a signal that something better, something great, the best possible path was coming. Lewis likened this situation to a general societal problem. The refusal to improve a non-solution with a makeshift solution, he said, was the attitude that left most of the world a muddy slope in need of repair. Making exactly this argument had in fact consumed a lot of his time in his first year at Basquiat, the NGO where he worked, which he believed was overrun by an ideological insistence on grand solutions that would be forever unattainable, instead of small-scale, implementable compromises. "Let's be realistic," was his self-parody catchphrase. "What can we do right now to make things better?" Why do you think refugee camps are never outfitted with proper infrastructure? He'd asked Anya just a few days before he'd been yanked back to the US. They were hiking up the mountainside in the rain toward their apartment, torsos harshly angled against the incline, sneakers slipping in the mud, dragging grocery bags. It was pathetic. Muddy scenes of neglect, Lewis shouted downhill at her, intent for some reason on having this discussion right at that moment. The worse things had gotten in the house, the more he'd taken to ranting. The mud is meant as a message that the bad situation isn't going to last forever, no matter how long it's already lasted. They want you to think the camp is just temporary, so nobody actually has to take responsibility for it. His voice rose as she lagged farther behind him. The quality of the now, he yelled over his shoulder, is sacrificed to the ideal. Do you know what I'm saying? Of course she knew what he was saying. But you realize you're comparing the Berg to a refugee camp, right? That had ended the discussion. Today she was carrying only a few avocado peelings in the pockets of her vinyl windbreaker. The whole apartment was a hot, puffy bruise. She didn't dare force anything down the drain. She waved to a group of electricians in blue coveralls who were standing bored around a post that was supposed to be supporting one of the vine cables of the cable car. They had raised the car onto a stack of wooden pallets. One of the workers dropped a cigarette butt onto the exposed end of a vine cable half buried in mud, and it let off a sorry spark. Unhitching her bike from a post at the bottom of the slope, she saw that Lewis's racer was still locked to a tree. He must have taken the train. She plugged her phone into the charger between her handlebars, checking it for messages. Damian had already sent out his first weather blast of the day. Dry, 35 degrees, lavender, wet west gust. She checked her phone's weather app for comparison. High of 24 degrees, calm, clear. The gap between the official version and Dom's version, the real version, shouldn't have still bothered her, but it did. She slotted an earbud into each ear and began taking the long ride up to Prenzlauer Berg to Howard's. It would normally take half an hour, the length of one podcast, but she was lumbering on the pedals today, swinging from side to side with each push. She was exhausted, and true to Dom's forecast, there was a hot wind coming from the west. The sky was purplish with stratified layers of clouds, each like identical faded copies of one another. Add a layer, duplicate this layer, flatten visible. She listened to the podcast with one part of her brain, thinking with another part about what must have been happening in the lab at that very moment. She was mildly anxious to be missing the morning there. She probably should have asked Howard to meet in the evening instead. The week before, the simulation she and Michelle had been hard-coding for weeks had finally authorized cell culturing. Today would be the first day in at least 2 months that they'd be liberated from their screens, finally doing tiny things with their actual hands in an actual little polystyrene dish. It was strange to look forward to an action while knowing already without a doubt how it would unfold. They had seen the routine perform itself again and again in high-definition render. The airtight predictability of the chain of events was the only reason they were allowed to make it happen in a dish at all. She saw the animation in her mind. One cell membrane swelling to accommodate a new blot on its periphery, for one freak moment an egg with 2 yolks. Then, the new blot forcing itself outward to the splitting point, when the edge of the cell would erupt from its boundary to become a whole new edge, scooping remarkably away and burping into its own self-contained shape, from impossible to possible. Plop, said Michelle each time they watched the duplication unfold on screen. Plop, plop, plop. Anya consoled herself with the fact that today wouldn't really be the most important day. It would be tomorrow, when a surface visible to the naked eye would begin to form from all those slow plops. The plops were designed to perform very slowly, growing into a skein of tangible matter. The surface would be translucent at first, shaving itself over the hours into a perfectly symmetrical double wave like the contour of the roof of a mouth, but impossibly smooth. And so small, conform perfectly to its constraints, the shallow dish only 88 millimeters in diameter, the simulated site map of the simulated shelter, the architecture's designated terrain. By the end of the second day, the duplicating cells would have built a delicate little home, rising layer upon parametric layer until it was exactly right. A perfectly circular, double-arched roof. Then it would stop. Cartilage in its first official architectural application. A perfect, growable, reproducible, scalable, durable roof, which Finster could send anywhere in the world as a tiny bundle of cells that would sprout on demand. Cells that would first be grown in their lab at Randy. Anya could already see Michelle struggling to repress his excitement. She'd mock him, call him Dr. Evil, but they'd both give in to self-congratulation for a few minutes when the thing was finished. The week would offer a release valve from the tedious months plugging variables into a giant data sheet and pretending not to give any fucks about their jobs. On the other hand, they would have to admit to each other with a few uncomfortable glances. The success was a turning point. It made them responsible for what they were doing at Randy. Until now, the eye-rolling and the sarcasm had masked the unease, but soon they'd have to pretend even harder not to care, work even harder not to know where this was all headed. She'd think about that next week, once they had accomplished this small exercise in form, a proof of concept that was surely just a small step in a process that would take years before implementation. The stoplight at Janowitz-Brücke gave pause to the pedaling and the imaginary cell growth. A swarm of teenagers in red caps crossed the street, briefly enveloping her. A trio of girls wearing their caps backward, oh, pitiful resistance, followed closely behind one another. It was easy to spot the popular girl at the front of the pack right away, simply from the geometry of the flock in motion. What was it about the girl, Anya wondered, the homely girl preoccupied with her phone, that made her the focal point, the yoke at the center of attention? What was the factor upon which the self-replicating algorithm turned, the remarkably consistent geometry of popularity? How had Anya still not figured out the answer? The hidden parametric logic to social arrangements, even after all these years, even as an adult scientist. The light turned yellow and the group hurried by, ushered forth by a red-shirted chaperone. At the same time, according to the podcast she now zoned back into, jellyfish were taking over the oceans as other species died out in the too warm water and made way for them to proliferate, spreading across the surface in a thick quilt, clogging the gears of power plants and blocking the flow of oxygen to the depths of the sea. So I'm going to skip way ahead now to the second part of the book, where we are in a former art gallery that is now more like a showroom, and a performance that is also a product launch has just ended. The crowd had begun applauding once more. An enormous amoeba with 1,000 wiggling nuclei. Anya had often wondered who the real nucleus of the social scene was, the truly central person who anchored the existence of the blob and kept it internally churning, gave it the life energy it needed to continue partying and gossiping and having sex with itself and doing drugs into infinity. Who was the person without whom this crowd simply could not function? Where was its center of gravity? And then where was its outer limit, the membrane? The center was elusive, almost impossible to identify, but Anya had always been sure it was there. There was an internal logic to the social order, its mechanisms so predictable that there had to be a single actor policing its behavior. Or maybe, she thought now, observing the shuffle, this was actually a self-regulating organism with distributed, not centralized intelligence, its logic irreducible to any of its constituent parts. A tensile, redundant mesh network of glances, text messages, sweat droplets, gifts, jokes, non-jokes, payments, diseases, repulsions, attractions. From afar, everything looked to be moving in concert, although as individuals, everyone maintained the belief that their behavior was autonomous, free will. This night would organically follow the same pattern as every other night. Performance finishes. Friends of performer push to the front of the crowd to make themselves known. Friends take their places beside performer and turn around, ready to receive congratulations on behalf of performer. Adjacency to fame is falsely presumed equivalent to fame. Performer selects friends who will be invited to the dinner after the event. When the first dinner guest, guest zero, has been appointed, the others will rearrange themselves in proximity to guest zero. Although guest zero may or may not have the ability to actually confer the invitation further, like fame, invitations are falsely presumed contagious. As invitations are slowly bestowed down the pageant line, the mass continues to jumble itself until a silent call is sent through to the invitees, like an electric zap only they can feel. The cars for the dinner are leaving. Say your goodbyes. The invitees politely and or condescendingly disengage from their sorry companions, casually mentioning a dinner, which everyone knows to be the dinner, making promises to meet up later, kissing, then slipping off. The event is left without its lifeblood. The people who own the venue may even be gone. Only the interns are left tending to the evaporating crowd. Without a dinner, the aspirational possibilities are temporarily curbed until the wasted, makeup-smeared regrouping later at the bar or the club, when the hosts and guests of the dinner will once again mingle with the uninvited. And so for the time being, the people left over separate into their home groups, their friend alliances, in order to plan their own feeding, because food is going to be necessary at some point if the second late night round of opportunism is going to be possible. And certain friend modules will try to sync up with others, extending alliances for the evening, us three and you four, which necessitates excluding others. There isn't room in the car, so sorry. Creating makeshift hierarchies where the major substructural one has vanished. The amoeba always keeps its shape. Thank you so much.